Hello, my name is William C. Anderson. I'm an author and an activist that's been working on something I want to tell you about. But first, a little background. When I was younger, I was looking for clarity around what my politics were and what I wanted them to say about me. I spent a long time around different organizations and different people looking for answers. Then a lot changed for me at an organizing workshop one day. I was co-leading it with a friend in aims of bringing together young activists across the South. I wasn't familiar with the guest speakers that were coming, but it turned out to be former Black Panther and founding Black anarchist Lorenzo Ervin and former Black Panther JoNina Ervin, his partner and comrade. That day, the two of them said things to me that would set me on a new path where I'd learn things about myself, be affirmed in exciting ways, and cultivate new hopes for liberation. I'd go on to read Lorenzo's legendary book, Anarchism and the Black Revolution, which helped me develop new language and gave me political education that I'll cherish for the rest of my days. We tried to keep in touch after that on and off over the years, but we finally come back together to get some things done. And that's what I wanted to share with you. The Black Autonomy Podcast is an expression of Lorenzo and JoNina's work with the Black Autonomy Federation, which is an association of Black anarchists who believe in the principles of autonomy. They'd been wanting to develop a podcast, and I've had the honor of helping play a part in bringing this project to life. These revolutionary movement elders have given me invaluable insights and perspectives that should be shared with the world in these times. So that's what we're doing. We're talking about liberation and fighting to get there. So please listen, join the conversation, and support this project in any way you can as we move forward. And without further hold up, this is Black Autonomy.
Hello, KBBF listeners, and welcome to a brand new show on KBBF, the Black Autonomy Podcast. What you just heard were the words spoken by William C. Anderson on the first episode of the Black Autonomy Podcast in 2021. William C. Anderson is a writer and activist and the producer of Black Autonomy Podcast. The Black Autonomy Podcast began posting episodes on its website in 2021. When we discovered it, we thought that it offered a very unique and important perspective that KBBF audiences could benefit from. So we reached out to them to see if they'd let us rebroadcast their podcast on KBBF, and we were lucky and very grateful that they agreed. The podcast is hosted by two very important people who are actually historical figures, JoNina Ervin and Lorenzo Ervin. JoNina Ervin was a dedicated member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in the late 1960s and early 70s. She was one of the editors of the Panthers newspaper and participated in their community survival programs, such as the Free Breakfast for Children program. She has remained in the struggle since then and has written the book Driven by the Movement. She is a co-founder of the Black Autonomy Federation. Lorenzo Ervin was also a Black Panther Party member. In 1969, Lorenzo hijacked a plane in order to avoid government persecution and attempted to find asylum in Cuba, but was refused. He was turned over to U.S. authorities and given a life prison sentence. However, after an international campaign in his support, he was released after 15 years. Lorenzo is considered one of the founding thinkers of Black anarchism and is the author of the book Anarchism and the Black Revolution. He's also the co-founder of the Black Autonomy Federation. Lorenzo and JoNina were generous enough to give us an interview to celebrate their inaugural episode on KBBF. So please check out the Black Autonomy Podcast online and listen on KBBF every first and third Wednesday of the month at 5 p.m. Thanks everyone and enjoy the interview. All right. Thank you so much for joining me, Lorenzo and JoNina. We are very, very honored to have you, not only as guests, but we're also just very lucky to have you as educators in the movement. We're very, very honored that you could join us and that you're still doing this work. Um, so now that for my audience, they kind of get a sense of all of your accomplishments, which is very, very long list. The main thing I think for my audience, and I think for the general, like the reason I wanted to do the show, participate in this is what the use of the word Black autonomy, and you also use the word Black anarchist. Um, that implies that it's distinct from other Black liberation movements. In other words, you wouldn't use different words if you didn't mean something distinct. What is the distinction? What makes it different? And why is it important that you use those words specifically?
Well, the ideals of Black autonomy originally came from the idea that the 1960s movement, the Black Power and Black Radical movement, was in fact independent of the political establishment, but it was also independent of the white left. And so that was one of the reasons we talked about Black autonomy and chose that name. But in terms of the anarchist movement, there had been ideological differences between myself and others who came into Black autonomy, which was the first Black Anarchist Federation. And so the ideas came originally that we would build a movement that, one, didn't depend on or didn't accept the ideas of statism, that everything had to go through the government or had to go through elected officials or anointed leaders and all this sort of thing. So it was a differentiation in terms of that, but it's also a differentiation in terms of the approach, which was a mass approach, as opposed to the kind of leadership you had in the 60s, some of which was authoritarian and some of which was based in the individual leaders. So we wanted to build a movement that was independent of all of that. And thus Black autonomy as an idea was born.
Did you want to add something, JoNina?
Well, I think that, Black people, it's a point that, Lorenzo often makes, that even the civil rights movement that, really was, strong in the 50s and the 60s actually was itself an autonomous movement, because it was mostly Black people who were saying that, we're going to chart our own, path for the Black liberation struggle in the United States. And it's also a reflection of the fact that within the larger anarchist movement in the United States, that there, is racism. Institutional racism is a problem, has been a problem in this country, in the United States, since the beginning. And the fact that we call ourselves Black Autonomy Federation means that as Black people, we feel that we have to be in charge and lead our own struggle because of the institutional racism in the country. Some people say, well, you're calling yourself Black anarchist or whatever, you're anti-white. We're not anti-white. What we are is we are a group that believes that we as Black people, just as if you are, Latino, if you are indigenous, you have the right to an autonomous right to chart your own struggle. And that is why the name Black is important. It is not meant to be anti-white. There are people of other nationalities who can support us, and they do. We have support group, but ultimately we have to be in charge of our own struggle because of the historical racism in the United States.
We don't really need to have time, or this isn't the appropriate place to define the kind of nuanced historical way that anarchism has been defined or changed definitions over time. That could be something that people could do on their own. But I think it is important, especially for my audience, when the average person in our society hears the word anarchist, there is an image that comes to mind, and it's not Black people. I am reminded of an essay that Huey P. Newton wrote on anarchism, where he critiques anarchism, but he defines it as white people. And I'm curious what your analysis of that is. Obviously, we wouldn't define anarchism that way that he did. Was he incorrect in that critique? Was he correct but used the wrong definitions? What is, I'm assuming you're familiar with the essay. What is your analysis of that?
Well, it's interesting that when I first came in contact with anarchism, it was not deemed, in my mind, had anything to do with the Black struggle. And I had rejected it, long before that. But I met a Black anarchist who was he became a mentor of mine, Martin Soster. And Martin, who was a Black Puerto Rican, when I met him, I was being arrested for a case of hijacking a plane to Cuba, was brought back to the United States, met him at the Federal House of Detention. He was there to sue the New York state government for violation of prisoners' rights, and that's a whole different story. But the thing is, he was a Black anarchist, and through him and his almost daily political education, to me, made me have an understanding that, yes, it's dominated by whites, but it's a movement that, one, has a historical basis going back even with indigenous peoples and movements. And also the history of it from the socialist movement, the failure of anarchism is just the same failure of that we're talking about in this period of Marxism. And Black Marxism and Black anarchism hadn't recognized the independent and autonomous history of other peoples from, suffering through colonialism, from suffering through racism, from suffering through all of these forms of systemic oppression. And so this was one of the things that Martin Sostre was able to make me understand, and also that it was meant to be an almost universal theory, and so forth, and that gave me an alternative perspective. Huey and the Black Panther Party were highly critical of anarchism, and I shared that sentiment at that time until as I said, I met Martin Sostre, and he was able to understand this as something going back farther than just the European association with indigenous or alternative politics and ideology. It was much deeper than that. It was in fact an attempt to create an alternative socialist tendency that didn't include state power. And so these things started me to thinking, and also the ties and the studies I started making in terms of independent Black people who were sympathetic to anarchism or who became part of the anarchist movement and so forth. But in looking at all of this, there was not a organized movement. There had not been an organized movement. And, if you really think about things within their context, even the Black Panther Party, which has been called some sort of Marxist-Leninist tendency and so forth and so on, the idea of Black people creating their own radical tendency at these certain historical junctures was something that nobody expected at all. I mean, he's speaking about the weaknesses of anarchism, but you could say the same thing about the weaknesses of Marxism and Leninism and all of this. The indigenous the indigenous and oppressed peoples have not factored into the analysis of these historical movements, and so that's why I've agreed with the Black Panther Party and Huey on that in terms of the weaknesses and the problems with European radical tendencies like anarchism. But at the same time, that does not close the door for a new tendency to come along that does, represent many of the views and the historical experiences of oppressed peoples.
Anytime you, by the way, JoNina, please, anytime you want to jump in, just jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, for myself, I thought that anarchism was totally irrelevant to the Black liberation struggle in America. And that and that's because whenever I would see anarchists, when I was in the Bay Area in the Black Panther Party, whenever I would see any anarchists, they would always be white. Now, there may have been anarchists of color in the Bay Area in the early mid 1970s. I'm not saying that there weren't, but all I could base my thoughts on were the fact that I didn't see them. So I made an assumption that this was a largely white movement, and it was a movement that, from what I could tell, was not doing anything to advance the Black liberation struggle. Therefore, to me, it was irrelevant. It had no. It was useless to me. I didn't even know that Black people were anarchists until I met Lorenzo, which surprised me. I said, a Black anarchist? So I had to begin to reassess my thoughts and my views on it. But many Black people, in fact, when they see protests, they're watching television and they see protests, and then some of the protesters are identified as anarchists. 9 times out of 10, they are white. And many Black people, when they see this, think, well, these are just a bunch of white people. What does that have to do with me? The Black community has not been educated about what anarchism is. And obviously we can't go into all that now, but the Black community has not been educated. And you see white people who are identified with it, you reach a conclusion, right or wrong, that it's largely a white movement, which is what I did.
Thank you so much for that. This is of course, I think both of you, your contribution to history, as far as I'm concerned, is this very important nuanced analysis. And I think one thing that Lorenzo mentioned that really struck me, well, you didn't mention it, but it kind of made me think. One of the things he said was, if you look at the really huge, big picture, and you're not thinking about, and you're not inside of it, right? If you try to take yourself outside of the movement and look at it, the Black Panthers Black Panthers were organizing in an anarchist way almost. I mean, I know they had a hierarchy. I know that they were inspired by socialist movements. I know that they were hierarchical, but as far as the moment in history they were in, it's not like they held state power. It's not like they were ruling over entire cities or communities. They were acting. They were organizing in a very anarchistic way, especially if compared to the traditional liberal social movements.
Well, they were radical. They were radical and certainly alternative, but they adopted the political structures of the day. What was deemed and accepted as radical movements was a form of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism. Okay. And they adopted that as their political program, as their organizational structure. Mm-hmm. And so from that standpoint, they were nothing near being an anarchist movement. Now, there were other things, though, that may confuse people as to what they felt about an anti-authoritarian form of politics. They were building based on what they knew and what was the political tendency of the day. And in that respect, they didn't build anything different than what some of the other groups had. You just had what they called back then an old left and a new left. And on the one hand, they were part of the new left. On the other hand, they were part of the Black Power movement. And the Black Power movement as a whole, which was a widespread independent or autonomous movement, which was distinct from civil rights, the civil rights movement, but they were part of that in the sense that they were one of the groups that represented the radical wing of Black Power, but they were never an anti-authoritarian tendency. Their politics were certainly radical, certainly advanced, and certainly approached many of the ideas of a mass line, mass struggle, and the power would be in the hands of the people. That was repeated over and over. That power would be in the hands of the people. All power to the people. But the reality was, as an organization, they were stifled by the same kind of authoritarian structure that the entire socialist and left-wing movements were suffering from at that time. They were captivated by it. And so they didn't have anything laid out as a method of struggle going in another direction. The idea of Black anarchism, or when I first wrote Anarchism and the Black Revolution, there was no discussion whatsoever, really, of the struggles of peoples who were fighting against colonialism in the third world and so forth. The Black struggle united with it, but the left-wing struggle in this country, which was primarily a white movement, didn't unite with it that very much at all. And for anarchists, they didn't unite with it or relate to it at all. And so I was one of the first individuals to come along and started raising this level of consciousness in the anarchist movement. And that's what anarchism, the Black Revolution, was about. It was about raising the consciousness of, white people and others who were in the movement, also to be able to track and politicize Black people, all over the world, in the United States, but all over the world, at a time when there was an active Black struggle. So we were trying to provide some new ideas, lay out some new ideas, at the same time, new political direction. And the party itself didn't do it. It's recognized today as a very important political tendency, probably the most important political tendencies emanating from the 1960s period. But it also, as I said, was trapped in a certain kind of political practice. And that's important to understand also, to not get confused. The party was not a pro-anarchist organization. It was not an anti-authoritarian organization. It was certainly an extremely important organization, and certainly an organization which provides everyone on the left a way forward, a way forward in terms of what its practice achieved, how it was a mass movement. As I said, how it had a line that, at least a political line, that theoretically the masses would take over and become the force more important than the party itself. The party would just be a tool to advance the mass struggle. But in reality, it was the same problem with socialism generally at that time and even now. And that is, the idea of leadership and charismatic leadership and so forth as being more important than the mass struggle or the masses themselves.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. You mentioned the term Black Power, which I think you've kind of outlined that there's a distinction from, 55 to 65 is known as the civil rights movement, and then 65 to 75 is known as the Black Power era, some people call it, and as you've said, it's defined by a very independent and more autonomous, more black, not depending on the white society for to reach its goals. And I think there is some confusion about this term Black Power because on the one hand, it does define this era of radicalism that you're defining, whether that radicalism be, the Panthers or Malcolm or anarchists. But then on the other hand, the term Black Power in history is very closely associated with Kwame Ture and his idea of Black Power, which is very different because it does have to do with electoral politics. How do you clear up this confusion?
Well, the initially, I think Black Power was not necessarily was not a term that it was solely looking at electoral politics. The term actually, Stokely Carmichael, who is called then now Kwame Ture, became Kwame Ture. He actually was not the one that did actually coin the term. I just think a lot of people don't really know that it was actually by another member of SNCC, Willie Ricks, who today is known as Mukasa Ricks. It was an effort for Black people to say that, yes, we have political power, but we have the power to define who we are, what we want our institutions to be. We're not going to be restricted anymore by what the larger, or the white society says we should be or what we should want. So, and it was also on a cultural level, it was something that gave, Black people a feeling of pride. I recently published a book driven by the movement, Reports from the Black Power Era. And, one of the people that I interviewed for the book, she talked about when James Brown, the R&B soul singer from the day, came out with his song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. She talked about how that song just really uplifted her. And it and in a way, it kind of became an anthem for the Black Power movement because it was a thing about Black people are no longer going to accept the fact that we are less than or we're second-class citizens. And you had this whole, Black students around the country were demanding that there be Black studies programs, that there be Black cultural centers. So the whole cultural piece was part of it, as well as the idea that for political power, which was part of it, Black political power. So it was a very broad. It was a term that encompassed a lot of things, but it was probably one of the most. It was one of the most of the 20th century. It was a movement that helped to redefine race relations in the United States, Black Power, from that period of 1965 to 1975.
Well, also we have to realize that what Black Power was an awakening. It was an awakening of Black America, and although it was an important cultural and social and even economic movement, more importantly for this discussion is that it became a radical alternative to what the government was doing in terms to repress Black people and had been repressing Black people since our arrival in this country. So it was a widespread movement, and it had the ability to radicalize communities, to have people fighting to create new institutions, to combat racism, to combat the fact that Black people had no political power, that they, especially in the South. And it linked up with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was at that time having an internal debate around Black power. And SNCC is important for a number of reasons, as we call it. One is in terms of it was the source of Black power organizing by young people. And it also was the source of radical Black protests against the Vietnam War and other struggles by Black people at that time. And it produced not only the several years of protests and by Black people and gave it political form and education. It also linked up later with a group like the Black Panther Party. And in fact, there was a merger for some years, and some of the leaders that were in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee became leaders inside of the Black Panther Party. So it had a really serious impact in terms of shaping the nature of the Black and radical struggle in the 1960s, so that the Black Power movement was not just a cultural tendency, as many have tried to depict it as a cultural tendency, but it actually had a radical political wing, of which the Black Panther Party and other groups of that period were part of. Now, they haven't been given much study, as opposed to the idea that this was some sort of major cultural tendency, or the poetry societies and so forth and so on, all this kind of stuff. We're talking about this ability to become a radical movement, to come up with some new politics independent of the capitalist state and the liberal reformists of that period. It was on the other end. It was on the left tendency, on the radical left wing of the movement. But it's important to be able to put it within context, because it still shapes a great many things. But we have to be careful of what the establishment has been doing in terms of just phrasing it as a cultural tendency alone, that you should worry about hairstyles and whether people are wearing African clothing and all that. That's just the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a much deeper question. It was a radical youth movement, and ultimately even became an international movement when it linked up with the anti-colonial tendencies abroad, all over the world, and other Black people, other Black, like for instance in the United Kingdom, it was extremely important there, and it swept through, the Caribbean and other places. So wherever Black people were in the world, it was extremely important that they linked up with it. They were politically educated by it in that period, and that's how it came to be a Black Panther Party in, for instance, Australia, where the Black people in Australia, which, a lot more Black people than you would think, but they linked up with the idea. They came and they formed the Black Panther Party in Australia. So this kind of thing is important, because it tells us what we're facing now, and one of the ways we have to get out of the level of oppression and so forth we have, and what the Black struggle should be, and what the Black anarchist movement and all these things that we talk about now, what it should be. We can have some examples of the successful Black Power movement. The mistakes as well as the successes are extremely important, but they themselves won't deliver us to freedom.
When before Malcolm X was assassinated in February 1965, he gave a speech, and one of the things he said in the speech was, he said, the young Negroes coming up, And they don't want to hear that turn the other cheek stuff no more. Mm. And to me, that kind of is a good way of looking at what it was. It was like, we're going to, young Black people were going to fight, for our rights. We're not just going to sit back and be passive about it. And Malcolm, he recognized that, because the Black Power movement was developing. He was able to see it coming up even before he was assassinated. So I always liked that quote that he gave. We're not the young Black people are not going to do that turn the other cheek stuff no more. That, to me, that's a good way to sum it up.
I know we only have about 10 minutes, but speaking of Malcolm, when the average person out there in the world, or maybe even people who are interested in this topic, when they think of Malcolm, they think of the term Black nationalist. Both of you, noticeably do not refer to yourselves as Black nationalists. Can you explain why you do not use that term?
Well, primarily because we don't believe in the state. We don't believe in government, for one. For another, we're not trying to restrict our ideas or our activities in terms of being in a government or empire, as this case may be, alone. We have to look at this. We have to take an international perspective. So we've always been internationalists, first of all. Even with the Black Panther Party, people would refer to themselves as being internationalists in terms of their perspective. They weren't limited just to the United States. And so that's one reason why we don't restrict ourselves to saying we're just Black nationalists. On the other hand, we don't believe that this government or this state which we're in will ever be granted our freedom. We will have to fight, and we will have to resist. And we have been resisting as a people for over, several hundred years. But we'll have to fight, and we'll have to continue to struggle. And it has nothing to do with the nature of the government itself. And so we're not satisfied with the state, whether it was a so-called call itself a democratic regime, or whether it's a fascist tendency, or whatever the case may be. There's always been this opposition among Black activists and the so-called Black radical tradition against, the government itself and the capitalist system itself. And so we on one hand, we consider ourselves part of the international liberation movement. On the other hand, we realize that wherever we are in the world, in this case, the United States, we have the continuing necessity to struggle for freedom. And we're not going to get it under the system. We're going to get it despite the system, and we'll have to defeat the system. And so that's the perspective we have. And so we don't look at ourselves just as the radicals did back in the 1960s alone. One is that we don't even accept the idea of some so-called separatist nation state. We don't believe in separatism, period. And that was also the perspective of the Black Panther Party. It did not accept the idea. It was, or at least its ideas changed from that over the long course of its existence, 15 years it was able to exist. They had changed their perspective. And Huey P. Newton said this as well in his essays, but especially the essay on intercommunalism. Mm-hmm. It's important to recognize that we have every generation, and Frantz Fanon said this himself, every generation has the responsibility to fight against injustice, whatever the form is, whether it's just racism or capitalism, which is the big one, and other forms of oppression. We have to fight against it, and to try to dismantle the system of oppression of every sort. So this is where we are, and this is where our perspective is, and how it's been built, what it comes from. We don't accept just the idea that there's some nation state to be built, another nation state. We have to dismantle the system that exists right now. We'll never be free under the system, even if we manage, as some people believe, to get some nation state or some territory, let's say in Canada or wherever, in the United States. What is the United States? The reality is, and this has been proven, is that imperialism, we live in an empire, and the empire isn't going to let us, it controls every country in the world. Let me put it this way. It controls every country in the world. We will not be free of that as long as this empire exists. This empire will exploit us, maybe a new form of exploitation, but it will exploit us nevertheless. It will oppress us nevertheless, as long as it's alive. And so the idea of just building a nation, we've, in our minds, has been, discredited.
All right. Well, that was the time that we had set aside. But I personally would love to continue these conversations in the future. I have a million questions I could ask about all kinds.
We'd like to continue it as well.
Yeah, this is great, and I'm sure most of our audience is going to be things that they've never been exposed to before, and I think this is really valuable. And I'm glad we're getting this historical document as well, because this stuff has to be preserved. So hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed the interview with JoNina and Lorenzo Ervin for the Black Autonomy Podcast. Check them out online and listen to KBBF every first and third Wednesday of the month at 5 p.m. Special thanks to William C. Anderson for producing the Black Autonomy Podcast. Thanks, and we'll talk to you next time.